Welcome to the first presentation of the Foundations of Disability Inclusive Education Sector Planning and the beginning of our journey together. Inclusive Education, Principles, Components and Approaches. As the title states, this course is intended as an introduction to disability inclusive education sector planning. Considering that the course is directed at ministerial staff from a range of departments, there will be elements that you may already be familiar with. In this first presentation of Module 1, you will be introduced to general concepts related to inclusive education and, of course, the concept itself. Through a review of the key principles of equity and equality, the concept of inclusive education, the components of an inclusive education system, and finally, models of educational placement, we will cement a common understanding moving forward. As evidenced by Goal number 4 of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, there is growing international recognition of the importance of building more inclusive education systems, thereby contributing to the goal of social inclusion. The UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, published in 2020 with its focus on inclusion and education, could not have been more clear in its call to action, underscoring the international commitment to inclusion. All means all. However, many challenges still remain, not least because education systems are slow to address persistent inequalities and exclusion from educational opportunities. Srey's story that you had a chance to watch earlier is a stark reminder that many systems continue to be ill-equipped to meet the needs of every learner at school and in the classroom. Srey, Kiri, Chian, and Dara are just 4 examples of young people who, for different reasons, suffer from exclusion. Let's begin by looking at the concepts of equality and equity. Understanding the distinction between these concepts is the foundation for building inclusive systems. We can use both approaches in an effort to produce fairness. Equality implies treating everyone the same, while an equity-based approach refers to giving everyone what they need to be successful. Equality aims to promote fairness. Everyone enjoys the same inputs, outputs, or outcomes. For instance, in education, equality means everyone receives the same learning materials, assignments, and are expected to have the same assessment scores. This may imply, in some contexts, that treating everyone equal does not necessarily mean everyone is treated fairly. Providing equitable opportunities may require additional resources channeled to those who need them with the objective to level the playing field. For some children or young people, this may mean flexible supports or adaptive environments in order for each and everyone to reach his or her potential. Think for a minute what Srey, the main character in our story, would need to remain in school. And what about Dara, the girl who takes care of the animals in the fields instead of going to school? What are her needs so she can attend school? Or Chian, the refugee? Or Kiri, the girl who just had a baby? How can a system provide equitably for their diverse needs to ensure equality of opportunity in education? This ties directly to the concept of inclusion as defined by the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is again a process consisting of actions and practices that embrace diversity and build a sense of belonging rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential and should be respected. So what does this mean for education? An inclusive education promotes mutual respect and value for all persons and builds educational environments in which the approach to learning, the institutional culture, and the curriculum reflect the value of diversity. Stated slightly differently, inclusive education should be understood as the means to move towards more equitable systems and ultimately more inclusive societies where people can live together and diversity is celebrated. The term inclusion represents a commitment to making preschools, schools, and other education settings places in which everyone is valued and belongs, and where diversity is seen as enriching. This commitment is not made just once, but continually, as the needs of the children will change throughout their lifetimes and from generation to generation. So, let's take a systems perspective and reflect on what makes an education system inclusive. First, inclusive education is not provided simply through inclusive pedagogy or materials or through building of ramps. It requires a whole systems approach where implementation is the responsibility of the entire education system and not only the classroom teacher. Education ministries need to assess their institutional structures and culture, policies and practices as part of a systems approach that is based on the principles of equity and inclusion. Such an approach means applying those processes, methods, and practices that aim at effecting systemic change. Acknowledging that education systems are complex structures and understanding their properties and dynamics is a first step towards making systems more inclusive. Second, as part of this process, the whole educational environment must be on board to foster the culture, policies, and practices to move towards more inclusive systems. From the classroom teacher to the principal, district official, and national policymakers, including the parents and the community more broadly, as well as other sectors such as health and social protection linked to education. All stakeholders need to be convinced of the benefits of inclusive education for society. Finally, the whole person must be taken into consideration. This means recognition is given to the capacity of every person to learn, and high expectations are established for all learners, including learners with disabilities. It commits to ending segregation within educational settings by ensuring inclusive classroom teaching in accessible learning environments with appropriate supports. This approach implies the provision of support and reasonable accommodation and early intervention so that they are able to fulfill their potential. Ultimately, inclusive education is about providing a personalized educational response rather than expecting the student to fit the system. Now, let's stop here for a minute and reflect on what may be needed to provide Srey, Dara, Kira, and Chun, the main characters in our story, with an inclusive education. Moving from a systems perspective to the perspective of the individual child, it may be helpful to think of inclusive education along the lines of these 4 components: the child's placement, presence, participation, and progress. Placement refers to the child physically attending a local inclusive school, contrary to a segregated or integrated environment where the child is not fully included. Presence refers to the actual attendance of the child in the classroom, which means how reliably and punctually he or she attends. Participation focuses on the quality of the child's experience, meaning its active engagement within the classroom, and finally, progress, which refers to the means of validating the participation and quality of inclusive education through academic assessments and more. In the following, we will take a brief look at one of the key concepts in moving towards more inclusive education systems. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities adopted the concept of universal design defining it as the design of products, environments, programs, and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. The concept aims to increase functionality and be applicable to everyone's needs, regardless of age, size, or ability. Whether for school buildings, public walkways, or physical appliances, universal design can be used to evaluate existing designs, guide the design process, and educate designers and users about the characteristics of more usable products and environments. As an example of its application in policy, in India, the draft National Education Policy states that universal design should be applied to schools' building design, sports facilities, and general environments, so all children benefit. In each state, a committee of cognitive scientists, early childhood education experts, artists, and architects is to be formed to design school spaces that are truly inviting and inspiring places to spend time and learn. Let's look at different models of educational placement that can typically be found within education systems and illustrate what inclusive education should not look like. We can distinguish between 4 different models: inclusion, integration, segregation, and exclusion. Exclusion refers to a child being completely out of the formal school system, denied his or her right to education. Segregation means the child is placed in a separate school away from his or her peers. This type of placement continues to be very common, especially with regard to education for children with disabilities. This model tends to isolate children from the community and, as a result, can fail to prepare them for an independent life within the community. Often, this educational placement is labeled as special education, implying that children in special education placements are a discrete and separate group with different educational needs from other children. Integration means that children are all in the same mainstream school. However, they are not placed in the same classroom with the other children. Typically, they are placed in separate classrooms with other children with disabilities. Whenever they are in the same classroom as their peers, the school itself focuses on supporting the child to fit into a standardized classroom. Inclusion means that children are all in the same classroom and all needs are met. Importantly, building inclusive learning environments is a continual process, not a series of one-off fixes. It is also not about fitting a learner with disabilities into a non-conducive learning environment. While this course will focus on children with disabilities as an entry point to the issue of inclusive education, it is important to keep in mind that many marginalized groups of children are excluded from educational opportunities. Exclusion often happens on the basis of gender, language, poverty, disability, ethnicity, and more. The Global Education Monitoring Report states that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, and 57% of those definitions cover multiple marginalized groups. Take a moment and briefly reflect on what marginalized groups in your country get particular attention within education policies. It is also important to remember that inclusion in schools is not a static phenomenon. Understanding and practice of inclusive education across countries are constantly undergoing change. In the past, the concept of inclusive education was mainly associated with children with disabilities, and in particular, their educational placement. Now, the focus is far broader, covering a wide range of learners who may be vulnerable to exclusion. Kiri, Tian, and Dara, the three characters from our story at the beginning of the course, come to mind. As countries define their approaches to inclusive education, the concept keeps evolving, shaped to a large extent by local and national approaches to its implementation. Having shed light on the concept of inclusive education, including its components and models of educational placement, we invite you to explore a key resource aimed at supporting ministries of education in making their education systems more inclusive. The UNESCO Guide for Ensuring Inclusion and Equity in Education looks at how we can ensure that all children get a fair chance at accessing educational opportunities and learning at school. It aims at helping countries to take steps to address marginalization, exclusion, and inequality, and to find ways of including all learners. It is built around an assessment framework that serves to review how well national policies take account of equity and inclusion, decide the actions needed to improve policies to implement equitable and inclusive education systems, and finally, monitor progress as actions are taken. Creating system-wide change for overcoming barriers to quality education lies at the heart of this process, ensuring access and participation and ensuring that all learners are valued and engaged equally. This introductory presentation has focused on the principles, components, and models related to inclusive education to provide us all with a common frame of reference as we continue to explore key concepts related to disability and inclusion. In the next presentation, we will take a closer look at what we mean by disability-inclusive education. We now invite you to watch the second presentation of Module 1, entitled Disability-Inclusive Education.